And it's great to be a part of Social Bridges and what has been a really interesting and engaging series of talks so far. So I'll be taking a slightly inverse approach today to talk about how we understand and relate to artificial agents, because in my work, I actually use artificial agents to as a tool to understand human social cognition and interaction, and the mechanisms that are engaged when we interact with artificial agents, as well as the psychological factors that influence the engagement of these mechanisms and that influence how we relate to other human agents. And so touching on some of the ideas presented by Antonia Hamilton yesterday and Emily Cross just now, I hope that this information will eventually inform how we can design and implement social behaviours in artificial agents and position them to maximise our ability to interact optimally with them in social contexts. And the context in which I do this research is joint attention, which I think is a really good paradigm for investigating reciprocal social interactions, but also social information processing. So joint attention is our ability to coordinate our attention with others and attend to the same thing. And this typically involves one person initiating a joint attention bid by looking at or gazing towards, or pointing towards or talking about an object. And then another person recognizing that behavior as meaningful and communicative and intentional, and also aligning their attention with their partner. And so joint attention is important because it allows us to share experiences with others, and it's through these shared experiences that we learn about others and how other minds work, but also how we learn through others experientially. And so language development, for example, is one type of social learning that we achieve through this experiential type of shared experiences with others. And so when we have difficulties achieving joint attention with other humans or other agents, these learning opportunities are mitigated. And this is often seen in autism, where joint attention difficulties lead to other social communication difficulties and developmental delays. Now, a problem with joint attention research and social interaction research more broadly is that the experimental paradigms that have been used to understand the mechanisms supporting these interactions have really failed on the whole to achieve a balance between ecological validity in capturing the full complexity of these interactive phenomena, but also achieving experimental control and objectivity in our measures of brain behaviour, often favouring the latter over the former. And so Leo Schulbar and colleagues in 2013 argued that this has resulted in this dark matter of social cognition, and argued that we really need interactive paradigms to understand interactive phenomena. And these paradigms need to allow two people to really engage and interact with each other, where there's a reciprocal exchange of dynamic and complex social information. So inspired by some early approaches using interactive eye tracking tasks, I developed this interactive eye tracking task where participants interact with an on-screen avatar who they believe is being controlled by another person named Alan in a nearby eye tracking lab, but in reality is controlled by a gaze contingent algorithm that simulates a reciprocal exchange of eye movements. And together they play a game where they have to locate and catch a burglar hiding inside one of these 6 houses on the screen. Participants have to search the houses with the blue doors, and Alan has to search the houses with the brown doors. And so on some trials, participants will find the burglar, make eye contact with Alan and guide him to the correct location. On other trials, they won't find the burglar and have to wait for Alan to guide them to the correct location. They also complete non-social versions of the trials where they have to engage in the same sequence of eye movements, but they complete the responding and initiating trials on their own by looking back at this central fixation point and catching the burglar on their own, or following this arrow cue to the correct location. And we've implemented this paradigm in an fMRI study to look at the neural correlates of initiating and responding to joint attention bids, separating out the social and non-social aspects of these mechanisms, and looking at the overlap of these mechanisms. And in using similar paradigms in ERP studies, looking at the neural time course of evaluating joint attention experiences, which I'll come back to later on. Eye tracking studies as well, looking at how we differentiate communicative from non-communicative eye movements during joint attention, and how we pass and process spatial signals that can help us predict an upcoming joint attention bid from non-communicative eye movements. And finally, looking at how joint attention responsivity can differ in autistic adults and adolescents, as well as patients with schizophrenia. And so these interactive eye tracking paradigms, and also those by others, have allowed us to creep closer to this dark matter, but they're still really limited in that they are using these pre-programmed agents, which are not quite Wizard of Oz. They are pre-programmed, but lots of assumptions have been made in their development about the temporal and spatial dynamics of the nonverbal behaviors that they display. And so going back to Antonio's talk yesterday, these paradigms that we developed in some ways are cheating because we're skipping that human-human interaction exploration stage of this research. Another limitation of this work is that it's been restricted to, in the most part, to examining joint intention based on gaze-only communication. And that doesn't reflect how we do joint attention out in the wild. Now, there are a few reasons beyond the practical reasons for looking at eyes only as to why there has been this historical focus on examining eye gaze and social interaction, but in particular joint attention research. One reason I think is the autism phenotype. We know that autistic individuals often have difficulties looking at eyes and establishing eye contact with others. For many, this can be a distressing or even physically painful experience. And so it's often been assumed that these difficulties with looking at and processing gaze in autism are fundamentally consequential for other aspects of social cognition. And therefore, they must be important in neurotypical social cognition and interaction. And I think there are some flaws with that logic, which I think is to be discussed in another talk. But another reason is this cooperative eye hypothesis idea, which is the idea that human eye gaze is very physically salient and unique in that we have this high contrast between our sclera and iris that make our eye movements very salient to conspecifics. And this has potentially allowed us to collaborate with others in a pre-language era of our evolutionary history, but to also allow us to signal threat to conspecifics. And another idea is that eye gaze is unique or special because it serves a uniquely dual function in both signaling and perceiving social information during interactions. And so for this reason, it provides continuous and ubiquitous information about what someone is looking at and what they might be thinking and intending to do next. But I think this is an interesting argument to make because this very feature of eye gaze also makes it an inherently ambiguous and noisy signal for coordination, because an eye movement on its own can mean a whole range of different things, and not all eye movements are meaningful and communicative. And so the reality is that we don't use eye gaze information in isolation, and sometimes we don't use it at all to coordinate with others. Not all our interactions are face-to-face, many are side-by-side. And that might in some small part, explain why we find this new norm of face-to-face communications over Zoom so taxing and tiring. So you and Smith have recently argued that other types of nonverbal cues that we can use to achieve joint attention, like a situationally relevant hand gesture, a pointing gesture, whilst it might be less ubiquitous and slower to execute than a gaze shift, it can be more spatially precise, less ambiguous in conveying intent, and also require less social cognitive processing to extract the relevant spatial information to guide our responses to joint attention bids. And so in a related study, they found that in infant parent dyads, infants actually allocated very little attention to their parent's face during joint attention and during joint play. And so perhaps eye gaze is actually not so important in coordinating with others, at least in early development. But this is tricky because the parents were triadically attending to the face and hand object dynamics. So it's unclear to what extent interacting adults integrate and allocate attention across multiple nonverbal cues to coordinate and align with other agents. So to address this question, we had 21 dyads come into the lab and we immersed them in virtual reality using head-mounted displays that had integrated Tobii eye trackers inside them. And we also tracked their hand pointing movements with a motion tracker sensor on their index finger. And we immersed them in a virtual reality environment that where they were able to naturally move their eyes, their heads, and their hands as they played a joint attention task with their partner. And so they had to initiate and respond to joint attention bids using a hand pointing gesture in this task, but there was no explicit mention made of eye gaze at all. And so in this task, on each trial, participants would see 3 numbers presented on these cubes in front of them. They could only see their side of the cube. And so if they saw 3 even numbers, so a 2, a 4, and a 6, they had to initiate joint attention to the highest value number, so the 6. But if they saw three odd numbers or a mixture of even and odd numbers, they had to wait for their partner to initiate joint attention and respond by also pointing to the correct location. And so this created a task context in which participants had to shift their gaze around the social environment to identify the target of joint attention, but to also determine their social role as the initiator or the responder. And there was an equal division, I should say, of trials in which people were the initiator or the responder. And so I'll show you a very short video of what one trial looked like. So here you can see the initiator points to initiate and the responder points to respond. Very simple and very quick. I'll play that one more time. And so one of our first questions were in this study, in this context where participants are explicitly initiating joint attention with a hand pointing gesture, which is very spatially precise. Are they actually conveying any useful gaze information that can also support coordination? And what we expected to find was that initiators would predictively and congruently fixate the target before pointing to the target. And although this was true on some trials, there were also trials where this wasn't the case. So on this particular trial, what you'll see is the initiator actually finds a number 6 straight away, but then has to search the other 2 locations to make sure that they are also even numbers. And then she initiates joint attention without predictively gazing towards that location. So she's displaying incongruent gaze point behavior. And so her eye movements here, her gaze shifts are not predictive or useful in facilitating joint attention responsivity. So we actually found that this initiator gaze congruency behavior was highly variable across participants. It was congruent on about half the trials, but as you can see here, some initiators were quite reliably predictive in their gaze behaviors before initiating joint attention, but some initiators were reliably unpredictive in their gaze movements in the lead up to a joint attention episode. We also wanted to see whether responders of joint attention were actually attending to their partner's face to extract gaze information during joint attention. And this was measured as an overt fixation on their partner's face, the initiator's face, during the joint attention episode. And again, we found that this behavior was also highly variable across participants. You can see here that it happened on average about 60% of the time, but there's also some participants here who were reliable face lookers during joint attention, and others who very rarely looked at their partner's face during joint attention. But the critical question that we wanted to ask was whether responders are actually integrating and using gaze information to facilitate their responsivity to the point-cued joint attention bids. And we measured this as saccadic reaction times to the pointing gesture. And we analyzed these data using linear mixed effects models, including subject, pair, and trial as random effects. And we found that participants were significantly faster to respond to point-cued joint attention bids when the point was preceded by a gaze shift that predictably cued or was congruent with the target location. This was true when we modeled all of the trials, and also when we separately modeled the trials where participants overtly attended to their partner's face, but it wasn't significant when participants didn't overtly attend to their partner's face. And so it suggests that this gaze integration does require, at least in this context, overt attention to the agent's face. So what we find here is that even though we're not relying explicitly on the use of gaze, either as an initiator or as a strategy, as an initiator or a responder during joint attention, we do convey useful gaze information, we do attend to this information, and we do integrate this information to guide our responses. But this does vary in the extent to which we do this across individuals. And so I think an important future avenue for research looking at how we interact with other agents, whether they be human or artificial agents, avatars or robots, is to look at all the many factors that influence how we engage in these different implicit or explicit social information processing strategies with others. And some of these factors include contextual factors, like what type of interaction are we engaged in, how many potential targets are there, are they dynamic, and what types of different behaviors are we integrating when we collaborate and interact with other people. Also, how similar the dyad are to each other and how similar they perceive each other to be and how familiar they are with each other. And psychological factors like mood and personality. So if you are an introverted person or a socially anxious person, are you going to attend to gaze information less and use that strategy less? And finally, what we're looking at the moment are how differences in initiator behavior changes our strategies for social information processing. And some of the factors that we're looking at are differences in the salience of gaze shifts, so how much head movements are involved, but also whether we use gaze information strategies more if we're interacting with an agent who reliably provides us with useful gaze information. And so ways in which we're asking these and answering these questions is by using variations of this paradigm, where we also have participants come into the lab and interact with an agent, with a confederate who we train and cue to behave in a certain way. So offering some more experimental control by sort of programming a human in real time. But also moving back to these artificial agents where people come into the lab and they think they're interacting with their human partner, but they're both interacting with an artificial agent that we program and manipulate aspects like salience and gaze reliability. The difference here with our previous work, however, is that we are using genuine human behavior to drive the temporal dynamics of gaze and hand movement behavior. So this provides a nice segue to the second part of my talk, where I'll be talking about whether it really matters if people believe that they're interacting with an intentional and sentient human agent or a computer that isn't sentient in these artificial interactions. And this question initially emerged for me as a methodological question because I initially assumed in my early work that it was an important ingredient in ecological validity for participants to believe that they're interacting with a human. But I wondered really whether this was true and whether the practical and ethical challenges that arise by using this deception are worth it. As will also become visible, evident in the next few slides, and Emily touched on this as well in her talk just now, we can also use these manipulations to try and tease apart the social specificity of the mechanisms that underlie social interactions. But as time has gone on, I've really appreciated the importance of these manipulations and this question for understanding how these expectations and beliefs change the way we perceive and interact with other artificial agents. So if you cast your mind back to the Burglar Task with Alan that I talked about before, in our initial studies using this paradigm, we came across an interesting pattern of initiating behavior that participants exhibited across several studies. And so in this task, when participants find the burglar, they're actually required to look back at Alan, establish eye contact, and once mutual eye contact is reciprocated, they can look back at the target to achieve joint attention. Likewise, in the non-social task, when they find the burglar, they look back at a central fixation point, they have to wait for that to turn green, and then they look back at the burglar to catch the burglar on their own. And what we found was that participants showed this behavior where they would sort of dwell on the burglar when they found the burglar and were hesitant to look back at Alan to establish eye contact in the social condition. And if they did, they engaged in these premature saccades back to the burglar to initiate joint attention without patiently waiting for Alan to reciprocate eye contact. Whereas in the non-social condition, participants were much better at quickly looking back at the fixation point, waiting for that to turn green and looking back at the target. And so one of the reasons for this was I didn't expect this to be the case because I thought establishing eye contact in this context is really important for conveying your communicative intent with your partner. But it occurred to me that this makes sense in the sense that in everyday interactions, we don't explicitly make eye contact with people as a strategy. We look at things and we use other cues, and we expect our partner to be motivated enough and intelligent enough to follow our attention and look where we're looking. And so I thought, well, a great way to test this hypothesis is to see if people do the same thing when they don't believe they're interacting with a human and when they believe they're interacting with a computer. And it turns out they don't. So when people believe they're interacting with a computer, they don't display this behavior, and their performance is commensurate across the social and the non-social conditions for both of these measures of initiating behavior. This was also matched with differences in some subjective experiences during the task. So people who believe they're interacting with a human found the task less intuitive because Alan wasn't behaving how they would expect a human to behave. But despite this, they found the task more pleasant and more cooperative, and the interaction more cooperative than those in the computer belief condition. So there's something very forgiving about believing that you're interacting with an intelligent agent, in this case, a human. And so we can understand this behavior in the context of Daniel Dennett's intentional stance framework. So when we believe we're interacting with Alan the human, we adopt an intentional stance, and our behaviors are guided by assumptions that we make about Alan's intentions, his intelligence, his beliefs, and his rationality and motivation. So Alan is motivated to respond, and he's smart enough to respond. I don't have to make explicit eye contact with him. But when we believe Alan is a computer, we adopt a design stance, and we engage in the task from the very beginning, making assumptions, assuming that there's some sort of mechanism at play that we need to figure out how it works and hack this mechanism. So participants engage in the task from the outset, trying to figure out what they need to do to make Alan respond to them. And so they find the task more intuitive as a result in this context. So you can see how our expectations about what these agents are capable of shapes how our behaviors that we use to engage and coordinate with them. And so the final series of studies I want to show you is a similar paradigm that we used in an ERP experiment, where in this task, participants always had to initiate joint attention towards one of 4 locations. And they would then look back at Alan, and he would either respond congruently by shifting his gaze to achieve joint attention, or incongruently to avoid joint attention. And there was a whole cover story to explain why he sometimes did this. And we found that ERP's time lock to these gaze shifts differentiated these congruent and incongruent gaze shifts at a P250 and 350 interval, which we initially interpreted as reflecting the time course in which we evaluate the social significance and outcome, the social significance of gaze and the outcome of joint attention. But we could also interpret this as some non-social effect of attention or prediction error. So we thought a great way of teasing this apart would be to use a non-social condition, a conservative non-social condition, where participants interact with the exact same stimulus, but they no longer believe they're interacting with a human, and instead believe they are interacting with a computer. And we found these ERP effects to be much less reliable at the individual level and non-existent at the group level. And so, but we did find some individuals showing hints of this effect, and we hypothesized that maybe this is being driven by individual differences in our tendency to anthropomorphize, whereas when we don't believe that we're interacting with a human, but when we force people to believe they're interacting with a human, we're standardizing these tendencies to anthropomorphize because everyone is anthropomorphizing. We followed this effect up in a second study where we manipulated these beliefs within subjects, and we found that this P250 effect held true. So we saw these larger P250 responses when Alan shifted his gaze to achieve joint attention with us, but only when we believed that he was a human and not a computer. And this makes sense because you can only truly achieve joint attention with another sentient being. And we were quite compelled by this because this was true irrespective of the order in which people held these beliefs about the agent they were interacting with. But then we tempted fate, and we tried to replicate this in 2 groups, again, using this within subjects design, but in 2 groups who either interacted with the same stimulus or a mecha robot face stimulus. And to our surprise, we actually found that the stimulus didn't matter so much, but these intentional stance effects were less reliable than we thought at the individual level. But what was reliable were these congruency effects. And this time we did have data on individual differences in anthropomorphism. And so we had a look at the size of the congruency effect when people believe they were interacting with a computer. So they don't explicitly believe they're interacting with a human. And we found here that the size of the congruency effect was correlated with their disposition to anthropomorphize. However, this is highly tentative data, and there are problems with how we measure anthropomorphism, but I think this is a really promising avenue for future research and further factors that we can explore when looking at the factors that influence how we process social information with other agents, whether they be human or non-human. And I think there's lots of work to be done at also looking at differences not only in whether we manipulate intentional states as human versus computer, but different types of computers. So intelligent artificial agents and maybe less intelligent artificial agents. So I'll finish there, and thank you for your attention, and thank you for all the people who've contributed over the years. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Nathan. That was really interesting, and still I need to have some more time to digest your findings. If you can unshare your screen, then we can see you in full glory. Wonderful. Yeah, I'm working, thinking about the perceptual co-representation in right now on human and robot and human. So that is super relevant for me and really interesting. So thank you for that great talk. I'll just directly move into questions that we had in chat. What is the type of information that we receive from the other's eyes? The fact that they are thinking about an object, are aware of an object, are communicating something to us, or all of the above?
I think all of the above. And but I think the problem with a lot of the previous research, and mine included, is that when there's only eye movements available to us, it's very difficult to figure out what these eye movements mean. And so that's why in our previous research, we had this real emphasis on almost forcing participants to make eye contact before initiating and responding to a joint attention beat, because in this deprived form of social communication, it's your only way of saying, differentiating whether an eye movement is non-communicative and searching in an environment or communicative. And so that's not the case in realistic face-to-face interactions where we actually use other gestures like hand pointing gestures, but there's also context. So if we're talking about a dog and there's a dog nearby and I quickly look at a tree, the tree is that gaze shift, we immediately disregard that gaze shift as being less relevant to the conversation being had. And so I think it can mean all of these things, but it depends on the context.
Okay, wonderful. Then I think we can directly jump into the next question. In the numbered blocks coordination game, do you think people would perform worse if they didn't see each other's eyes?
I think not necessarily. I think what the eyes present is, I think there's a trade-off, a computational trade-off. So if the eyes are reliably providing congruent and predictive information, then it does take more social cognitive computational processing to attend to both of those cues and to integrate those cues, but it will make you faster if the gaze information is reliable. If it's not reliable, though, it's a much better strategy to actually ignore the eyes completely, ignore the face completely, and just follow the hand cues. It might make you slower overall, but you'll be using less, it'll be less computationally demanding. And so we're actually in the middle of running a study with autistic teenagers who are doing the same task, but with this confederate setup. And in this task, the confederate's gaze is congruent on half the trials for all of the participants. And so here there is sometimes an advantage and sometimes not an advantage for using gaze. And what we find in our autistic participants so far is that they attend less to the gaze information of their partner, but overall, they're actually trending slightly faster in responding to the gaze cues because there is not a net advantage for using gaze in that context, because gaze is not more reliable than unreliable in that case, if that makes sense. So I think, again, it depends on the context and it depends on whether the gaze information is reliable in the first place.